Boundaries serve a protective function in our lives. They help us ensure that our needs are met, that we are safe in our relationships, and that we aren't extending ourselves beyond our capacity. So today, we're going to answer some key questions about boundaries to learn more about them and their role in our lives. As humans, we strive for authenticity. We want to be ourselves and live our truth. On the surface, this seems like an easily achievable goal. Who else would we be if not ourselves? The truth is that many of us struggle to be ourselves. Societal pressures and the expectations of those around us influence our motivations and behavior. We often act in accordance with what other people want rather than with who we really are. But it doesn't have to be that way. To change, we need to get clear on who we truly are, what we want, and how to defend our true self from outside influences. This is where boundaries come in. So what are boundaries? You are likely already familiar with the term boundary. A boundary in physical space is a line that defines the space by its limits. For example, when you look at a map of the United States, each state is defined by the line that separates it from other states. Just as boundaries define a physical space by identifying its limits, they can also help us define our own limits. In other words, when the outside world is trying to affect or manipulate our behavior to serve its interests, boundaries help us create limits on what is and is not okay with us. Personal boundaries can be understood as the limits and expectations we set with ourselves and others that make us feel safe and whole. Setting boundaries can look different depending on the boundary and the context. So let's now talk about a few common examples of boundaries. One example of setting a boundary is saying no. No is a word many of us are taught is unkind or unfair, so we are reluctant to use it. Rather than enduring the discomfort and perceived potential consequences of setting a boundary, we compromise our truth instead of saying no. Another example is defining the limits of acceptable behavior. Something that is hurtful for one person may not even be noteworthy for another. Limits serve a protective function by minimizing the amount of harm or disruption that we experience. One last example includes clearly articulating your expectations. This helps define the role of each person in a relationship and helps both parties meet each other's needs. An expectation can be something as simple as expecting your friend to return your shirt in the same condition it was in when they borrowed it. So, why are boundaries important? Personal boundaries are an essential part of living an authentic life. We require boundaries to know who we are, to thrive and keep us safe, and to meet our own needs. When examined closely, we might find that boundaries could improve our lives in nearly every way. So let's briefly discuss a few more reasons why setting boundaries is important. First, boundaries honor who we truly are. Setting boundaries is an acknowledgement that our needs are valid and we are worthy of having them met. When we move through the world without boundaries, we may place the needs of others above ours, disregarding our own needs in the process. We may also dismiss our needs as unimportant or identify ourselves as someone who isn't worth all the trouble. When we set boundaries, we shift these false beliefs, honoring the simple truth that all of us are worthy of care, respect, and safety. Next, boundaries help protect us from outside influence and manipulation. In other words, when we set strong boundaries, we are less likely to be coerced into behaving in ways that conflict with our authentic self. They also help protect us by ensuring that our needs are met and that we are not overextending ourselves in ways that harm us. Boundaries also help us avoid burnout and resentment. When we overextend ourselves or allow someone to repeatedly violate a boundary, we will start to feel burned out and bitter. Unfortunately, we don't always notice this happening until it's too late. By setting and upholding boundaries early on, we protect ourselves from these undesirable states of mind. Boundaries are also essential for healthy relationships. Ironically, one of the main reasons we are reluctant to set boundaries is fear of damaging our relationships. However, setting boundaries improves healthy relationships. Being clear and direct about what our needs are provides a greater sense of trust and connection. If someone is unable to accept our boundaries, that tells us a lot about the health of that relationship. Boundaries can also help us identify gaslighting. Gaslighting is a recently popularized term that is defined as a conscious or unconscious form of psychological abuse that occurs when a perpetrator distorts information and confuses a victim, triggering the victim to doubt their memory and sanity. In the context of setting boundaries, gaslighting might manifest as someone making you feel like you're doing something wrong by setting boundaries, or that your boundaries are unfair in some way. You may hear statements such as, "You're overreacting," "You're being selfish," or "You're too sensitive." These statements may suggest that someone is trying to manipulate your perspective to align with their own. Reflecting on your true feelings can help you recognize whether you are indeed being unreasonable, or whether the other person is trying to silence your truth. Remember, you always have a right to advocate for your needs. So, where do boundaries come from? Our boundaries begin their development in childhood and are heavily influenced by our experiences in the first years of our lives. These experiences may be directly responsible for how, why, and when we set boundaries. For example, if we didn't have role models showing us how to set boundaries in childhood, we may struggle with setting boundaries as adults. So, let's start talking about how to set boundaries. In order to set healthy boundaries, we first need to identify what our boundaries are. There are several ways we can go about identifying the parts of our lives that are missing boundaries and what we want those boundaries to be. Here are some tips. First, tune into your feelings. Getting in touch with our feelings is an essential step in setting boundaries. For example, noticing when we feel resentful, overwhelmed, or compelled to dissociate are all important indicators that a boundary is missing. Next, we can practice naming the boundary. Talking about our feelings has long been observed to help us understand and manage them. In recent years, neuroscience research has revealed that putting your feelings into words, also known as affect labeling, produces a calming effect. In other words, affect labeling changes activity in a brain region known to be involved in feelings of fear and anxiety. The stress reduction brought about by naming our emotions can help us process and respond to them, rather than becoming overwhelmed by them and reacting in ways that are counterproductive. By naming our emotions, we can better identify if we're upset by someone crossing our boundaries, and then state or restate our boundary. Once you know your boundaries, there are two main steps to setting boundaries: communication and action. Communication is defined as the exchange of informational messages between a sender and a receiver. For humans, this is commonly done through language. However, words carry more than just their literal meaning. Context, tone, and body language all combine to express the true meaning of what we're saying. This means that the person we are talking to has to interpret what we are saying, and we have to interpret what they say in response. This series of interpretations leaves open many opportunities for miscommunication, especially when it comes to boundaries. If our goal is mutual understanding, it's important that we enter the conversation with kindness and an openness to different perspectives. We want to be sure our boundaries and the needs they reflect are understood, so it's vital that we speak clearly, honestly, and kindly. Effective boundary statements begin with I need, I want, or I expect. For example, you might say, I need you to call before you come over. Or, I want you to stop asking questions about my private life. Or, I expect that you will return this without me having to ask you repeatedly. Step 2 is sticking to the boundaries you've set with action. This is the only way to show others that you are serious about your boundaries. Boundaries are about you, not the other person, so the action should always be something that you will do. For example, I might say, if you continue to call me names, I'm going to stop answering the phone when you call. Chances are that many of the boundaries you will set are going to involve people with whom you did not formerly have boundaries. You might finally be setting a boundary with your nosy aunt or your friend who always flakes on you. When this is the case, it may take some time for them to adjust. In many ways, you've just changed the rules of the game, and they may unintentionally violate your boundaries out of habit. Remember, it can be really hard to change a behavior, especially after a long time. Offering others grace as they learn to adjust will be helpful, but it is critical that you firmly and consistently uphold your boundaries. If you brush it off because you don't want to argue or because it wasn't an egregious violation of your boundary, you will quickly find yourself back at square one, and this time it will be even harder to set and maintain the boundary. So how do we maintain boundaries with difficult people? Ideally, everyone you set a boundary with will accept and respect your boundary. Unfortunately, however, you are likely to encounter some people who will continue to push your limits and ignore your boundaries long after you have set them. It is important not to over-explain yourself when confronted with pushback. If you provide too many details or go into a background story, you give the other person more opportunities to argue and more ways for them to try to change your mind. When dealing with difficult people, just do your best to remember that your needs are valid and they are important. This is where self-knowledge and unconditional self-acceptance will come in handy. Difficult people will likely try to make you feel bad for setting a boundary in the hopes that you will cave. But when you know what your needs are and can accept yourself, flaws and all, you won't be easily swayed by their manipulative tactics. So, when it comes to boundaries, you should be the most important person in your world. A good relationship with yourself is an important part of being able to uphold boundaries in the face of pushback or bullying. Like any other relationship, making promises improves the relationship, and breaking them damages it. So if you're ready, make a promise to yourself to set the boundaries you need to live the life you really want. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and check out our free resources at berkeleywellbeing.com.